Salut Nicolas, ça va?
Salut Jamie, ça va?
I'm afraid that's as far as the French is going to go today because despite having a half French wife, my competence in French is not good enough to have this interview. And I know your English is much better than my French, so I apologize. But it's great to get the chance to talk to you. Thank you. We've had a few interactions on Twitter, so it's good to have a proper conversation and have you as a guest on Sentientist Conversations. And as I've mentioned, it's a series of conversations about what I think of as the two deepest philosophical questions and the most important: what's real and what and who matters. And I have a bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize this very simple worldview called Sentientism, which suggests when we're thinking about what to believe and what's real, we should take a naturalistic approach committed to using evidence and reason, as opposed to, revelation or fideistic faith, for example. And when it comes to what matters and who matters, the clue is in the name, that it suggests we should grant moral consideration and have compassion for all sentient beings. So any being that has the capacity to experience suffering or flourishing. But I'm talking to people in these conversations who disagree with or agree with that philosophy and worldview. So it'll be great to understand your own personal story. But before we get to those questions, how would you best introduce yourself?
Okay, so hello, so I'm Nicolas Treich. I am French. I live in the south of France, in Toulouse. I'm part of a department in economics called Toulouse School of Economics. I'm also a researcher at INRA, which is the French Institute of Agriculture. And so I am, as an economist, my background is in decision theory. So I used to work a lot on mathematical modeling, trying to represent individual and collective economic decisions, mostly in a risky situations. So that's my background, my focus of my PhD thesis. Then I moved on in terms of application to environmental issues, climate change and other issues. I did also quite a number of papers on behavioral economics, meaning at the interface of economics and psychology. And some, I would say, about 8 years ago, I started some research related to animal welfare, which is very new. In economics, it's really a niche topic. Essentially, all economics is anthropocentric, so it only considers humans, in particular humans as a source of moral consideration. And I got interested in animal issues, and so that's quite broad, as you know. It includes the issues of meat consumption, veganism, but also other topics such as environmental impacts and moral issues, of course, and so on. And so I think most of my research these days is about trying to include some animal issues into mainstream economics, I would say.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. And that was how I first came across your work, because this anthropocentric focus on humans is so pervasive in almost every field of human endeavor. Politics, news and media, psychology, sociology, and certainly economics. And I've almost developed this habit of just trying to think in a very amateur way about each of those different fields and just recasting them from a sentientist concept. So instead of having human politics, we think about sentientist politics, as Alistair Cochrane has written about. You can think about sentientist justice. You can think about sentientist development goals. You can think about sentientist declaration of sentient rights instead of just human rights. But economics is one field that I hadn't really thought that much about. So your work it's been fascinating to come across your work, trying to bust the anthropocentrism and maybe start a new field of sentientist economics. So it'll be fascinating to come back to that when we talk about how to make the future a better place, because I think that's it's a very important emerging field. Yeah, so thank you. So let's start with the first of those big philosophical questions, what's real and what to believe. So for many of my guests, that's a personal philosophical story about whether they grew up originally in maybe a religious or a supernatural or more mystical context, family, society, their own beliefs, or one that was more naturalistic or scientific or a mix of the two, and how that side of their thinking, their epistemology, has changed over time, if it has. So you can wind the clock back to your childhood, if you like, and it would be fascinating to know your story and where you are now on that big question.
Okay, so as you know, in academia, we are not used to talk about our personal life and issues, but I think it's very interesting because at the end of the day, a part, if not all, of what we do relates to who we are and what we have done and our even in childhood. As I said, I'm French. My parents are French. They divorced when I was very young. So I was partly raised by my mom, by my dad, by my grandparents. So I was moving around in the southwest of France when I was young. And they were all Catholics, but religion was not, as far as I can tell, it's of course always a bit difficult to reflect on that. But as far as I can tell, religion was not very important in my life. I went to church and so on, but it was not very important, and I didn't feel myself very involved into religion. And when I became adult, I forgot about it, and I'm not really opposed to religion, but I don't have a very strong positive views about religions, especially since I've been working on animals. I think, as you probably know, religion has contributed, at least some religions have contributed to this strong divide between humans and animals, this dominion, this stewardship story, and so on. And so I must say that I have changed. I have mixed feelings about religion in general, but I don't think it has been very important for me. And I was not either raised within a sort of very scientific atmosphere. My parents were not very well educated. But what may have played a role is that I've been surrounded by animals, dogs at the house, and my grandfather was a farmer. There were cows in the farm, and my dad is training horses for horse racing. So I've been surrounded by animals all my life, and I remember when I was a kid, I liked to view myself as an animal lover. And I was even some of my friends teased me about this, but I don't think it was very important either. It became important. Maybe I can talk a bit more on that later when I had my sort of vegetarian epiphany like 8-10 years ago. But before that point, I don't think it was extremely important in my life.
Yeah, thank you. So it sounds like there was a cultural default of Catholicism, but for your family, it wasn't a particularly important part of their world. And that sounds like it made it reasonably easy for you to just leave it behind. Some of my other guests have had, really traumatic, difficult experiences of leaving a religious worldview behind, but that wasn't my experience, and it doesn't sound like it was yours either. Were there any other aspects of supernatural thinking, for example, that have been attractive to you? Because some people I've spoken to have left a established religion, if you like, but they've found themselves feeling maybe spiritual but not religious, or having some sense of the transcendent or the magical or the mystical that might come through a connection with nature or the universe or some other aspect of the supernatural. Have you been drawn to any of that line of thinking, or are you fairly clearly sort of scientific minded, evidence and reason, that's the way forward?
As far as I can tell, once again, it's a bit difficult to really remember precisely my beliefs when I was young, but this sort of supernatural belief or magical belief didn't play an important role when I was young, and I think I'm clearly on the reason, evidence, science. At least I like to see myself as a sort of scientifically minded person, and I tend to be quite suspicious, skeptical to these many types of beliefs that are beyond the science, I would say. Even though I understand that we cannot explain everything, and there are some mysteries in this world, it's not something that is important in my life, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. And I like the way you described the influence of religion on ethics, because that's the next question we'll come to. And I like the balance you described, because there are some explicitly religious rationales for example, anthropocentrism. As you said, humans are special because we're made in the image of God. We've been given dominion over others. Non-humans are there for our purposes and so on. And you can see that playing through. But we don't need religion to come up with anthropocentrism. Most people with a very naturalistic worldview have found, supposedly naturalistic approaches to still get to an anthropocentric start. So we can't blame religion too much. I think it is it's one source of rationales that can cause harm, but it's certainly not the only one. Us humans are very good at finding justifications for anthropocentrism, whatever our epistemology is. So, yeah. And I also like the point you made that, just to remind us that even academics are real people too. So, yeah. And quite often these worldviews and these sort of deep assumptions, I don't think we talk about them enough. They're often implicit, or they sit behind the way we work and engage with the world. But that's why I quite like coming back to these really fundamental, basic questions and exploring them a little bit. Partly because most people on the planet have got the answers to them wrong, and they're off working on some other detailed stuff. But if you've understood the world incorrectly, you believe things that just are unfounded. And as we'll come on to the next question, if your scope of moral consideration is set incorrectly, so that you're excluding beings that shouldn't be excluded, terrible things go on. So that's why I quite like focusing on these fundamentals. But,
yeah. I fully agree with that. And this idea of that human is exceptional is rooted in religion, but is also rooted in science. We have a very long experience in science of, like Descartes, for instance, believing that humans are very different from animals. So I fully agree. We should be also very in the spirit of always challenging our beliefs.
Thank you. Well, let's come on to this second question of what matters and who matters. So some people like to keep these questions very separate. The classic idea of this is-ought chasm that cannot be breached, and you can't get an ought from an is. Most of my guests and I think that there are stronger links, or maybe that chasm is overstated, but let's see where we go. But I guess the first question is for someone like you or me with a naturalistic way of thinking, a scientifically grounded way of thinking. An obvious question is, okay, so where do your ethics come from? If you don't have the Quran or the Bible, or the principles of the Bhagavad Gita or the Torah or the Hadiths, you don't have lists of rules. You don't have the concept of a deity who will judge you and punish you. So what are right and wrong, or good and bad? How do you respond to that challenge from a naturalistic starting point?
Okay, so I'm going to answer with an example related to what I think has played a role in my sort of vegetarian epiphany, the period where I started to realize that animal welfare counts, and maybe I should reconsider my diet. And that, I think, explain a lot. Is an example that is similar to what many other people have experienced. Because we are when we are raised, we eat meat. We don't really think about that. We build our morality around it. We don't really question it. And for some people, someday something happened, and then they completely change their view of the world. And I believe I had an experience that is related to that. So I think it was about maybe 10 years ago, and I was seeing a woman. It was a sort of date relation at the time, and she was vegetarian. And I remember I was during our discussion, I was a bit sort of passive aggressive. I was trying to challenge her, asking questions such as but what's the problem with milk industry, for instance, what's the problem with eggs, and so on. And then she explained to me repeated insemination, the male don't have really a value, and we destroy the chicks and so on. it was really obvious when she was explaining that, and to me that was I'm not sure if it's that discussion that really triggered things, but in retrospect it may have, because I like to see myself, as I said to you before, as a rational scientific person who hold informed beliefs. But here we have a case in which it concerns a choice that I make every day, several times a day, my diet. I like to see myself as a rational person. I like to see myself as someone who cares about others, in particular animals. And my beliefs were completely wrong. I was completely ignorant about what's going on in that industry, and that really was quite a question mark for me. What's going on here? I didn't see that while it's quite obvious, and I had wrong beliefs. So what happens in what did happen in my brain, in my mind, and in that society, so that I couldn't see the obvious? And that was the starting point, I guess. And from that, so that's the theme of cognitive dissonance in psychology. And I was in economics about 10 years ago. We started to think about this theme of this topic of cognitive dissonance. And that was my starting point. Apply this question of cognitive dissonance and myth paradox and to try to formalize it in economics. And then I started to inquire about that. And as I am part of a French research agricultural institute, it was easy to get information. And every time I had new sources of information, it was bad news. I was always optimistic about what's going on in the farming industry. All the time, it was basically the worst case scenario that I discovered. And that was just a discovery, a very bad discovery. And then I started to discuss with colleagues, and I realized their beliefs were very, very mistaken as well. I remember one time that one of my colleagues is an expert in the milk industry. She knows everything about the milk industry. And one day she came to me and she said, "But what's the problem with animal welfare in the milk industry?" She's an expert in that field.
Yeah.
So to me, that's very revealing. People don't want to see, don't want to know, even the experts, even the person who know everything about what's going on with the way we raise animals.
It's amazing, and those social norms are so powerful. It's as though we start from, and this is another area where I do think ethics and epistemology link together, because the starting point, whether we acknowledge this or not, well, normally we don't. The starting assumption is what I do and what the people around me do is normal. Because it is normal, it is therefore good. And everything else flows from that. So you start with a conclusion, which is not a scientific approach. Yeah. You start with the conclusion you want, and then you will do anything required to support that. And in my own introspection, I use the full available toolkit of psychological mechanisms to make that work. So, I avoided the topic because I didn't want to engage with it. When I did engage with it, I, warped my understanding of the facts, and there is a well-funded industry out there that is desperate to tell you that farming animals is humane. And there are billions of desperate consumers who really want to believe that because it means they won't have to change. And then, as you say, cognitive dissonance, acrasia, so it warps not only your epistemology and leads you to hold incorrect, unfounded beliefs, even experts, but it can also warp your values and ethics because you're almost forced to reshape what you think is ethically important to enable you to carry on doing what you're doing before. It's so powerful. In a way, it gives me a lot of hope because I think many people have a latent ethic that you and I share. I think most people care about non-human animals. Most people aren't, at least in concept, totally anthropocentric. So that gives me hope. But it's also depressing because the social norms are so overwhelmingly powerful and extremely hard to break. And as you've implied, even with experts and academics and people who are committed to using evidence and reason, just laying out the facts is, it's rarely enough for a similar epiphany. So,
yeah, I really like what you said here, and in particular, using the language of economics, I really believe that there is a demand for cognitive dissonance, but also supply for it. I mean, the industry is feeding these mistaken beliefs, and so there is really I think we need as a social scientist to use our tools to really understand this very complex system that maintain these beliefs that lead many people to think that everything is fine with the farming industry, or most practices are fine and it's under control and their policies are well done and so on.
Yeah, and in a way you've answered both of the questions. What matters and what is ethics, but also the second question about moral scope and who gets to count in our ethics. But in that first question, why do you care about other humans and other animals? If that isn't a silly question to ask, what is it that leads you to care?
That's a good question. Of course, there are evolutionary reasons for why we care about others, in particular humans, cooperation and so on, but I'm not sure we know in general why we care about animals. I think it's really an under-researched question. I mean, there is a lot of research about empathy within humans, also in animals, but why we humans care about animals, I think there is very little research on that. I'm not even sure why I do care about animals. What I guess we know from scientific results is that we care more about some animals than others. For instance, we tend to care about dogs, about horses. So typically the animals we have learned to cooperate with. So there is an evolutionary advantage to learn and to be empathetic toward these animals, such as dogs and horses. There is also this ideas that we have compassion to take care of babies, and so maybe we extend that to animals that look like babies and so on. So there are these theories around, but I'm really not sure why I care about animals and why humans in general care about animals.
Yeah, and it's an interesting because it's a difficult question to ask answer in a way, because you can answer it descriptively. You can talk about evolution and motivations and psychology and behavior, but you can also talk about it normatively, I guess. And in that sense, it is really just a choice. It's a choice to have moral consideration for or have compassion for others. And again, in these conversations, it's been fascinating because some people find their way into that compassion for other humans and non-humans in quite a naturally emotional, empathic way. They grew up with animals, they've spent time with animals, they just feel that connection and it's an emotional thing. With other people, it's sometimes even quite a cold intellectual exercise where they're just saying, the science shows those other beings suffer. If I have any moral consideration at all, if morality means anything, it has to mean some compassion and moral consideration for them. So, just technically, it makes sense. If I want to have consistent ethics and I don't want to have arbitrary ethics, then it's a sort of logical operation. And I think for most people, it's maybe a mix of both. There is a sort of intuitive compassion that I think all of us have to some degree, and then people sort of extend it and challenge it and try and make it more consistent and less arbitrary to varying degrees. But personally, I use the concept of sentience to draw my moral scope. And I think there's a good overlap with the term animal, because I think, most of the animals that we interact with have sentience, although I think there are some differences around the borderline, and that is also a fuzzy area when you look at the very simplest invertebrates, or if you look at a sea sponge, for example, it's technically an animal, but it probably isn't sentient because it has no nervous system. So I guess, and the idea behind this sentiocentric and sentientist stance is saying whatever sentience is, and whichever beings have it, we should be open-minded and scientific about that. Sentience and the capacity to suffer matters. So that's how we're defining the scope. But there are some people who will challenge that and say, look, you've gone too far. We should concentrate on humans, and only humans really matter. And you and I would disagree with that. And I think it's, in a way, that speciesist approach is as arbitrary as many of the intra-human discriminations. Why just pick a morally irrelevant characteristic and exclude suffering beings on that basis? But there's another challenge as well, and I know you've done some work that goes into these spaces when people are thinking about the environment and the biosphere too, where some people will say, look, sentientism doesn't go far enough. We also need to have direct intrinsic moral consideration for all living things. So the biosphere, biocentrism, for example, and plants, which most people think are not sentient but are living, or even more broader than that, a sort of holistic ecocentrism that says rocks and rivers and plants and trees and even the earth as Gaia warrant intrinsic moral consideration too. So what are your thoughts about going beyond sentience?
So first of all, talking as an economist, let me state again that in economics, essentially all research is anthropocentric. So if we have these three categories of moral approach: anthropocentrism, sentientism, and then let's say ecocentrism or holistic approach. We are clearly in the first category, like 99.99% of the time. So
Yeah.
So that's the way we approach that in economics. And I think at least within the utilitarian tradition, which is essentially the tradition that is followed in economics, conceptually, it's not very difficult to extend that approach. Basically, we say now in economics that we humans have utility, and as a normative objective, we should maximize welfare. So basically, maximize utility. If it is utilitarian, is the sum of utilities in the society. So then now we just have to plug animals, the animals that we consider as sentient, and then we maximize the well-being of humans and animals. So conceptually, it's not really a revolution, but in practice, it is a revolution, because now we will need to measure welfare. We always it's not even clear how to measure human welfare in economics, so we have discussed that forever. But now, if we have to measure animal welfare, it's extremely difficult. And to, in particular, given that the many animals and we need to put moral weights. We need a lot of inputs from biology, philosophy, and let's say neurosciences and so on. And we need to compare to humans. So that's really a research challenge. So my take on that is that we should go into that research area. It's difficult, it's challenging. But these days, essentially, nobody in economics is doing that challenging step. So this is the road we should take. And it's very natural to start with species that are close to us, like mammals, birds, and so on. We know they are for sure, almost for sure, that they are sentient. And we have learned a lot from them. But I leave it open to extend the moral line, maybe to insects. We can put some probabilities. We can possibly even include plants, even though at this point, based on the evidence I know, I don't think plants are sentient, and I'm not sure I would assume that plants should have moral consideration, but I'm open to it. But of course, they certainly have a value, because they sentient life live thanks to this species, and that also includes the moralistic approach. So if caring about the world simply is important because it helps sentient beings to have a reasonably good life, I'm happy with that.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. And I think I feel a similar way in that the way I framed sentientism is it doesn't tell us which beings are sentient. It doesn't have a stance on philosophy of mind either. So there are sentientists who have very radical different views about what consciousness and sentience really are. But it just says, the capacity to suffer and flourish matters, whatever it is and wherever we find it. And we should follow a naturalistic approach to try and understand where those boundaries are. And they may well be fuzzy boundaries. There may be difficult things to work out, but suffering should still matter wherever we think it might be. So I think that open-mindedness is deeply important to those other ideas. I'm also open to the ideas of there being value beyond sentience. So in a sense, sentientism says you have to grant moral consideration to every sentient being, but you can go further if you like, but just don't exclude any of the sentient beings. Now, personally, the value I see in plants, rocks, rivers, trees, ecosystems, and so on, for me, there is enormous value there. But as you hinted at, it's instrumental because of its impact on all of the sentient beings. And that is different from it having its own intrinsic value. I think there is a really fundamental deep chasm between crushing a rock and cutting the throat of a pig, and it sort of seems obvious to say, but so I'm quite a strict sentiocentrist, if you like, but I don't mind people going a little bit further as long as none of the sentient beings get excluded. And that's going to be really interesting, because as we come on to this final question of how can we make a better world, your work in economics is really important. And from my amateur understanding of economics, the development of the field seems to be echoing some of the changes that we're making in human culture generally. So people look at economics in its traditional context, and they will think of it not just as something that's exclusively human, but also it's quite weird using that acronym, for, I think it's Western educated, industrialized, rich, is it developed? But it's also come out of quite a Western oriented mindset that is quite focused on white rich males in developed economies, and that's been the sort of center of gravity, if you like, of economics. And there's been a number of moves within economics to think about feminist economics, to think about development economics. So within the human scope, to try and balance that out and make it more egalitarian and more broad and more inclusive and more considerate of all of humanity. And obviously that work is ongoing. But then there's been a second, strong focus within economics, which is saying, hold on, the environment matters too. So whether you look at Kate Raworth's donut economics and some of the work you've analysed and criticised, the Dasgupta review, and the economics field is now starting to take environmental concerns very seriously as well, whether it's ecosystem services or existential risk to humans and so on. But again, as you've hinted, economics seems to have gone from this sort of traditional subgroup of privileged humans to trying to think more broadly and more generously about humans, and then jumped to ecosystems. But it's sort of forgotten the ring in the donut, if you like, about non-human sentient beings. And I think that's analogous with where human culture is generally. It's jumped from a sort of anthropocentric, let's think about universal human rights after the Second World War, and now there's a burgeoning global consciousness, still tragically ineffective, that seems to have a really rich environmental and ecocentric concern. But even the people expressing that urgent ecocentric concern seem to have forgotten all of the maybe sextillion non-human sentient beings that can actually suffer. So that's part of my frustration, is that I don't mind people going to an ecocentric or a biocentric stance in ethics or economics, but you can't skip the non-human sentient beings. If you're going to expand your moral scope, it can't be it's supposed to be a moral circle that keeps going out. It can't be a moral donut with humans in the middle, environment here, and then just a horrible gap which allows us to continue exploiting, harming, and killing. So, sorry, that's a mini lecture, but it feels to me like economics has sort of gone down that path. Humans matter. Now all humans matter. Now the environment matters. And your work is trying to address that gap in the middle. I don't know if that's a fair description.
Yeah, I think it's fairly a fair description. I have a similar frustration as in other disciplines. Economics is what economists are doing, and that is a bit shaped by who are the economists, and there are biases for sure. For a long time, it was male were dominated. I mean, mostly male researchers. Of course, it shaped the agenda. Most prestigious departments were in the US, so that shaped the questions and the data that were used and so on. So indeed, it's the animals are not part of the agenda. We humans have political power on Earth. We decide the research budget based on human well-being, and so we are not going to provide a vast amount of money for research on that is going to improve the well-being of animals. So for sure, there are these political forces that also affect the research outcomes. I agree with that. And I agree also with this trend that economics is expanding, and it can be illustrated with the winners of a Nobel. In 2002 or 3, we gave a Nobel to Dan Kahneman, who is a psychologist, So that's the behavioral economics development. And a couple of years ago, we gave it to William Nordhaus, who is an environmental economist. So that illustrates some topics that are developed in economics.
And I think the most recent prize was given to some developmental economists as well, I think. So again, it's still within the human space, but recognizing the importance and diversity of the field there. Yeah. One of the other interesting things about economics is, I think, partly because of that history, because of that traditional history, many people outside the field look at economics, I think, in quite a narrow way. They think of it as about money, about markets, about capitalism, and sometimes that will already make them deeply skeptical of the entire field, as if they'd like to just abandon it and do something that feels more humane and organic. But I guess the way, as an amateur, I tend to think about economics, and you hinted at this in the way you described the imperative to actually measure and assess welfare, I think ultimately it's about, for me, it's about value. And when I ask myself the question of what is value for any sentient being, it does come back ultimately, often through quite a complex chain of dependencies, to the experiences of sentient beings. To my mind, the experiences of sentient beings, the experiences you and I are having now, and our ability to keep having them through the rest of our lives, and whether those feel good or bad to us, those experiences are the raw material of ethics and morality. Feeling good and feeling bad, to me, links directly to the good and bad of causing those things in other beings. So it's the raw material of morality. But it's also, I think, ultimately what we mean by value, because whenever we talk about, well, what might you might value this coffee I'm drinking, or you might value your family relationships, or you might value a forest you walk in. The reason you value those things is ultimately because of the impact it has on your experiences and the experiences of other sentient beings. So others disagree about that, but for me it feels like the grounding raw material of those things. But to my mind, those things are the raw material of economics as well, because it's not just an economic transaction to buy food or produce food. The reason you buy that food is to, enjoy the sentient experience of having that food and to sustain your ability to have sentient experiences in the future. So in a weird way, that common ethical grounding in the quality of sentient experiences, as you said, whether it's utility or welfare, or you measure it in some other way, is also the grounding of economics. Am I pushing that too far, or how do you think about how economics relates to value and ethics?
So I tend to agree with most of what you say. I think that many people have wrong beliefs about what economics is about. There are many myths about economic science, and many believe that economics is only about financial flows, markets. It's not the case. This is true that we have some benchmark result, like what we call the welfare theorem, that tells us that if everybody maximizes his or her own interest, then we reach an efficient solution. So this is the Adam Smith idea that the baker is not producing good bread because he's altruist. It's because he wants to sell bread. And so the market forces make the best of us. So that's the sort of benchmark result that hold under some conditions, but we know in economics that these conditions are never satisfied. And most economics is about studying precisely why these conditions are not satisfied. It could be because there is a monopoly situation, or an externality, or public good situation, or asymmetry of information, and so many. And so most of what economists are doing is about analyzing how we can correct these inefficiencies. I'm going to give you an example that illustrates these beliefs that many people hold about what economics is about. So 7 years ago, my colleague here in Toulouse, Jean Tirole, got the Nobel in economics. He got it for his research on to address market power. So typically when some firms have too much power, and so that's an inefficiency, and the regulator needs to regulate the firms. But then the French media, when they read the announcement of the Nobel by Jean Tirole regarding market power, the way they got it is that he got his Nobel Prize because of his research on the power of markets, which is exactly the opposite idea. It's not about, his research was not about the power of market, it was about market power. And so that shows how many journalists think about economics. It's only about markets and their power, and that's a mistaken belief. And for your information, these days my colleague has a very interesting paper entitled "The Morality of Markets." So you can see where we are now in economics. We really try to think about whether markets are moral or not. And so I fully agree with you. I think we. Economist is and economics is often presented in a way that is very schematical about what we are doing, and it's mostly about it's indeed a lot about value. I would add it's a lot about incentives. We want to understand why people make some specific actions and how we can affect these actions, and also the beliefs. So economics is a lot about the sciences of incentives.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I'm going to ask you a difficult question here, but if you imagine a situation where you develop this field of sentientist economics, so it becomes the default assumption in the entire of economics, and all the other economists say, Nicolas, this is so blindingly obvious that all sentient beings, warrant moral consideration, their value counts, we're genuinely going to expand the field. So the field of economics now becomes sentientist in its assumptions. I guess two questions. One, how do you think that would have an impact in the world, and what do you think the world might look like once sentientist economics has become the default assumption and widely accepted? What could the utopian future look like?
Okay, of course, that's kind of a dream to imagine that economics will become sentientist.
It's only a matter of time.
Yeah, it's only a matter of time, maybe, but at least, as I said before, conceptually, it's not. It will not be so different, because we just have to expand our approach and to expand our the object of well-being in our usual models. Let me add that I think there could be two channels where we compassion toward animals, or let's say pro-animal choices could matter in economics. One channel is through compassion. So that's really more about behavioral economics. So we want to better understand the psychology of people. So we in economics for the last 20 years, we've learned a lot about social choices by people, pro-environmental choices. And I think the next step is to have pro-animal choices to better understand these choices. There is a lot of psychology research on that. Cognitive dissonance is part of it, the me paradox, for instance, but there are many other topics, and we need to understand what really matters to people so that they can think about animals, they can act in favor of animals. That could go through fiscal instruments, for instance. It could also go with nudges, with information, with norms, and so on. So that's one channel. But there is another channel which is completely distinct from compassion. It could happen without compassion, and it's really what we call social choice. It's really a field at the interface of economics and philosophy. And here basically it says that we should attribute moral consideration to animals because they matter morally, even if people don't care.
Yeah.
The problem with that approach is that in practice, humans have political power. So we cannot really rely too much on that approach. But still, there is a scope for it. Think about future generations, for instance. Future generations, politically, they have no weight. They don't vote. But still, they matter somehow. So that's a direction of research, I guess, but we should think about how we can really make we can use this social choice to affect our, let's say, social decision in practice, and that's really challenging. Yes, I'm not sure I have fully answered your question, but
No, that's a good start. But I agree. There's as I've looked across lots of different domains, it's remarkable how conceptually easy it is to extend from anthropocentrism to sentientism using many of the same tools. And like I said, I've rewritten the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I've done some work on what sentientist development goals might look like. And I think you're right. With economics, you could actually just use many of the standard tools and extend them out. But at the same time, there are real difficulties around social norms and human psychology and politics that mean, just having analytically the right answers isn't enough. But I could imagine a situation where, with a much more sentientist economics, you could see some radical, quite powerful changes. Ideally, the complete end of animal farming and exploitation, for example, maybe a very different way of valuing ecosystems that recognize the value of the sentient beings in the ecosystem, not just thinking about ecosystem services for humans in the way we think about externalities and so on. So, yeah, I think it could have quite a deep, powerful impact. But as you imply, it's not enough by itself. There's politics and psychology and norms getting in the way too. But I think having a sentientist economics will be a powerful force for good.
Yes, I agree with that. And in economics, we when we want to change the situation, for instance, to improve well-being when there is market failure, we have three ways to do it. One is to affect the supply side, so changing production. So if you think about farm animals, that would be about introducing norms, animal welfare standards. Personally, I'm not so optimistic about this because it's completely captured by agricultural interest. I mean, look at the greening of CAP, for instance. It's been a fiasco. It's been for the last 20 years or more. So there is little hope that if we try to regulate farmers, it will really improve the situation because the law is not there to really protect animals. It's there to protect farmers' interests, essentially. So, so that I think I'm not very optimistic to that we can use the supply side, and we can see that all the agricultural interests, they want to use the supply side approach. So we give subsidies to farmers and we improve situation, but I think that doesn't work unless there is a very important political change. But I'm not so optimistic about that. But of course, we can still take some. There is still some ways to improve the situation, but probably small steps. The second way is to affect the demand. So the changes in diets. There, I think we could be more effective, but still, I'm not so optimistic because habits are very strong. We like very much meat. There are the norms that you mentioned before. So I think it will take a lot of time. Even though there is an increasing proportion of people who are vegetarian or vegan, is still very small. So I'm not sure it will change. Maybe, but I think it will take a lot of time. And so, and the last way, which I would tend to favor as creating a big change, is innovation. Because research is improving a lot. Think about cultivated meat, for instance. Then you can use the traditional forces of economics and provide the food that people like. I mean, at least most people like, with less externalities, probably health and environmental externalities, and essentially no negative externalities on animals.
Yeah.
So I think that if I would have a word of hope to conclude our interview, I would bet on the innovations that are coming.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can pull all of those levers at once, but I share your sense that the substitutes may be, the thing that will drive us fastest. Yeah. So I want to ask you one final question before we wrap up. As an economist, I've spoken to people in these conversations who have radically different views on economics. They all share a sentiocentric compassion. They all base their views on evidence and reason, or most of them do. but they have very different views on economics. So some think we can move to a more compassionate version of capitalism, where consumers and producers and regulators all build in a sentientist ethic into their way of operating. So we have a capitalist system, but it's more compassionate. Others think that exploitation is built into the heart of capitalism, and we need to tear it down and have some form of more socialistic or even communistic approach. Others suggest we need a sort of anarchist approach, and there are many different varieties there. It's a big question to ask, but what's your sense of the right economic system, or the most realistic one going forward, as we try and think more broadly about sentient beings?
So if we look at the past to predict the future, I think we cannot really say that there is a correlation between the economic political system and how much the treatment of animals. I think you can, if you look at even the current situation now, you have very different political system across the world, and I'm not sure that there are, if you go from extreme, very strong capitalistic society versus communist societies, I'm not sure what we can say that there is a striking difference with respect to animals treatments. The part of the world where maybe we can see that animals are really taken into consideration seems to be the north of Europe, Scandinavian countries, for instance, so they have a specific economic social system. That also to tend to reduce inequalities, and it's not out of capitalism. It's just I think it's more into a sort of interpretation of capitalism with a lot of state intervention.
Yeah.
That makes sure that we can reduce inequalities, at least some type of inequalities. And I would, if I would have again to bet on a system that would help going in good direction, I would vote for this. I would bet on this type of systems for the future.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you. We've answered what's real, what matters, and how can we make a better future. And I'm really looking forward to sentientist economics taking over the whole of economics and helping to solve all the world's problems. But your work is so distinctive. So yeah, thank you very much. And please do stay in touch. What's the best way of people following you, reading your papers, learning more about your work?
I have a web page and I'm on Twitter. Nothing very originally.
That's great. And I will include those links in the show notes. That's great. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with me and for forging ahead with Sentientist Economics. It's been a pleasure to have you on Sentientist Conversations.
Thank you, Jamie. Ciao.
Thanks, Nicolas.